Hello there and welcome to JJ Painting. I am JJ, and what do we do on this channel? Well, we talk about the hobby, of course. Sometimes it's the lore, codex reviews, tips and tricks for both 40k and fantasy, Drunken Explains. There's a bit of something for everyone here. And today we're talking all about Chaos Space Marines. As you guys probably know, Chaos Space Marines have received a bit of a drubbing in the last couple of years, and they're definitely lagging behind their contemporaries in the Space Marines and even the other Chaos Legions. But that's not to say that they are hopeless. There are still some gems within that codex, and today we're going to talk about 3 ways to play them that makes the most of what strengths they do have in the codex as it is. Now, I should say that you're probably going to want to pick up the Psychic Awakening expansion as well, just so you've got a full range of stratagems for all of the legions that are in there, and that will give you a really good and cohesive way as to look at what we're doing today in this video, and you will understand what I'm talking about more thoroughly if you do. And for today's video, we're going to be painting this model right here, indeed very chaotic. So, without further ado, let's crack on. Okay, let's get straight down to business and talk about things that, for now at least, you can write off. So for one thing, regular Chaos Space Marine Lords, gone. Regular units of Chaos Marines, for the most part, gone. Khorne Berserkers, gone. And the reason I'm saying all these things about these units is quite simply because they have no place currently. They are quite expensive in the grand scheme of things, and yes, you can have cheap versions of them, but the moment you start pouring points into them, you're taking points away from the things I'm going to tell you about. And the sad thing about Chaos Marines for now is that there are so many things that have lagged behind in terms of damage output and in terms of resilience next to Thousand Suns and Death Guard that they simply cannot match up to them if you start taking them. As much as I do like the Chaos Marine models, and I like Chaos Space Marines, and I like the Chaos Lords, and I like Khorne Berserkers, they unfortunately won't do you any favours for the time being. And the other reason I say maybe not Khorne Berserkers especially is because considering how old those kits are, it's highly unlikely that they're going to be around for much longer in my opinion, but that remains to be seen. Anyway, so what should we be taking? Well, first of all, let's look at a new way of looking at the core of your Chaos Marine army. And let's start with your meat shields, as it were. Yes, I am of course referring to cultists. And I know in that my top and bottom 5 review of Chaos Marines, in my opinion, cultists are not one of the best units in that codex. But the thing to remember about that is that that's not to say they don't have their uses. On their own, they don't have much utility, granted. But there are 2 things that they do definitely have. First of all, they are extremely cheap. And second of all, they do still benefit from a couple of rules, even if they don't benefit from the Legion traits. If you're going to have your core units, it's worth having something that can stand behind them and be useful, and that of course is the Dark Apostle. So the core of your Chaos Marine army for the time being should be Dark Apostles and Cultists. And you have to remember that this is actually a very cheap combination, and there's a reason for this. First of all, Dark Apostles do still give the leadership boost to Cultists. Cultists can't get the Legion trait, but they can still be boosted to Leadership 9, which is very useful considering that they're going to take casualties very quickly and quite frequently. The second thing is that Dark Apostles can also use their litanies or their prayers on cultists as well. So if you want to get the 5-up invulnerable save on cultists, you can do that with the Dark Apostle without there being too much of a problem. Dark Apostle at time of recording is only 80 points, and for 10 cultists you don't have to spend any more than 50 points. So whilst they do have parity at least with things like Poxwalkers, and they can have a little bit more ranged output, they definitely do have some worth here. So your core, as it were, is 90 points. And even if you are going to have a very small game of 500 points, that's still a good thing to know because you can pack it out with everything else. And as a result, as you get into bigger and bigger games, you can start putting more and more in there. So even if you need to go into a battalion detachment, having 2 blobs of 20 will only cost you a very small amount of points. It's 100 points for 20 cultists, and if you want to give them things like heavy stubbers to give them a bit of range, if you want to give them flamers just in case you need to get an overwatch off, then that's very cheap as well. They're only 5 points each. So ultimately you're looking at a very cheap core. And bearing in mind that an already complete patrol detachment is a Dark Apostle and 20 cultists, and that is a grand total of 190 points. But that's the core, the meat shield. That's what you need to be able to maximize things like your command points later on, and you might want to keep hold of those as well, especially what I say next. The important thing to remember at this stage as well is that this core fits into all 3 of the categories that I think Chaos Marines fall into, which we're about to discuss very shortly. So irrespective of what I say goes around them, then this is the core, this is what you start with, and this is how you go. So the 3 categories of how to play Chaos Space Marines are thus: Demonkin, Hounds and Hunters, and Legion Synergy, and we'll go into each one of those, and they all may sound a bit strange. These may sound like three very particular aspects of Chaos Space Marines that have been quite well established over the years, and you're thinking, Josh, these already exist. Well, there's ways of playing them that make them both quite rewarding to play, quite competitive if you're of that mindset, and also makes the armies themselves from an artistic side of things look quite interesting on the table. Now, when I say Demonkin, what I mean is the demonic units within the Chaos Space Marine Codex. Because if you look back at the Codex, there are two things most of the demonic units have in common. The first thing is they all have slightly higher toughnesses and invulnerable saves, and the second thing is they tend to be the ones that have multiple wounds. If we're specific for a moment as to what the Demonkin units would be in this army, we'd be looking at things such as Possessed, Greater Possessed, Obliterators, Lord Discordant, and Demon Engines. Possessed, for one thing, are toughness 4, granted, but they have 2 wounds. Obliterators have 4 wounds, the Lord Discordant has 8, and the Demon Engines, even though they are not necessarily known for being reliable at having good shooting or good combat necessarily, they do at least have a lot of wounds, and they are a relatively high toughness. So when you then add the Lord Discordant into that, yes, this is the sort of boon that you'd expect them to have or you'd want them to have, but ultimately it's worth remembering that putting them together allows them to synergize in a way that boosts the army as a whole, and it gives you multiple very tough units. And you have to remember that the Lord Discordant himself is quite a tough customer. He's not going to go down particularly easily, especially seeing how he is himself toughness 6 with 12 wounds. It's going to take quite a lot to kill him, and especially considering you don't have to put him out in the open in order for him to give his buffs out. When we think about things like Possessed, Obliterators, and the Demon Engines, all have a lot of resilience that will help quite a lot. And the thing about the Demon Engines you have to remember is that even though their ballistic skill is quite low, much like the Obliterators, the actual guns they have are very good, and being able to keep yourself close to the Lord Discordant will give you something of a mobile gun line as well. So it'll be a very mobile but very resilient gun line that can take a lot of damage, dish out a lot of damage, and will be very effective. And the other thing you have to remember is that, yes, whilst 9th edition codexes definitely have a slight power creep that 8th edition codexes don't, when you then start considering who has more wounds than others, it definitely starts to factor in more when it comes down to late game play. If you start losing stuff early on, it won't affect you too much, provided that you've got some resilient units in the game. And the thing about these units that I've mentioned so far, such as Obliterators, Demon Engines, and even the Lord Discordant and the Possessed, arguably, is that they can soak up quite a bit of firepower, and even if you're facing off against enemies that have higher AP weapons, they do at the very least still have an invulnerable save, so they aren't completely at the mercy of enemy firepower or enemy combat abilities. So let's talk about the legions that benefit most from this. Well, the three that benefit the most are the World Eaters, the Word Bearers, and the Iron Warriors. Now, if we start with the World Eaters, and why I said forget Khorne Berserkers early on, is because Khorne Berserkers with only 1 wound, toughness 4, and no additional saves are very, very vulnerable to getting gunned off the board, and even fought off the board if your opponent gets a charge off and they've already been weakened. The important thing to remember about Khorne Berserkers, and this is why I say they may not be the best choice for now, is that whilst they are good at dealing out damage, they will drop very quickly, and they are still 170 points for 10 of them, and that's quite a lot of points to pay for a unit that doesn't have a lot of resilience even in this edition. But what I would say with Possessed is that when you think about their Legion trait, the Legion trait for the World Eaters and also their Shock Assault effect means that on a bad day, a unit of Possessed will get 3 attacks, on a good day, they'll get 5. And there are lots of stratagems that the World Eaters have that can boost those numbers of attacks even higher, and it can boost that Death to the False Emperor, and even boost the AP of those weapons as well. And the other thing to remember about the Demon Engines is that they still benefit greatly from being within range of the Lord Discordant, who also gets these buffs as well, and there are plenty of Relics and Warlord traits that can help boost him even further. And even though I don't normally mention things like stratagems, relics, and Warlord traits, I will in this context, simply because the Chaos Space Marines don't actually have to worry too much about having too many stratagems to go through in their main codex, because there's not really that many that apply army-wide. They're quite spread out and they have to cover a lot of bases. So in this respect, I'd say that you can probably be a little bit more reliant that you will have some command points left over to use these stratagems, as they're all very much for one use, shall we say. Next up is the Word Bearers. Now the Word Bearers again have lots of very useful stratagems and warlord traits that help synergize the Possessed into the army more. You can end up with your general being a Possessed unit and having the demon keyword if he doesn't already have it. And on top of that, you've got to remember that obviously it goes without saying that Word Bearers will probably have some cultists hidden around in the army, so from a thematic side of things more than anything else, it works out really rather well, giving the Word Word Bearers this particular army. And last but not least, the Iron Warriors. Now the Iron Warriors are an interesting one because obviously you don't get any cover when they're shooting at you from their Legion trait, but their stratagems allow lots of rerolls, lots of boosting against vehicles, so it's worth remembering that when you've got things such as demons on the board, they can take the hits that other units can't, and even with the Iron Warriors traits, that can get boosted a little bit more to make them slightly more powerful. So, just to quickly summarise, Demonkin, demon units with things such as Possessed, Great Possessed, Obliterators, Demon Engines and the Lord Discordant, with World Eaters for the resilience, for Word Bearers for the combat synergy, and for the Night Lords for that resistance that can be boosted and getting those stratagem rerolls. That's a very strong way of playing Chaos Space Marines if you want an army that's more in line with the demon side of things and has a bent towards the close combat side of things as well. Next up is a slightly different way of approaching it, but keeping the core of Dark Apostles and Cultists the same, and that is what I call the Hounds and the Hunted. Now this is where we start to maximise things such as speed and decisive striking, getting into combat as early as possible, and staying there as well. If you're facing a gunline army, one of the biggest problems that you'll be facing, even with a fast army, is being able to cross the board quickly enough with enough of your army. But the good thing about this way of approaching it is it will give you enough time to get the fast things in, and the slower things will have time to get there. So even if your faster units do start taking heavy casualties, then you're going to be giving your opponent a serious target dilemma, if nothing else. Now, when we talk about this for units, to be specific, we're talking about things such as Bikes, Possessed again, Warp Talons and Raptors. And even though these are all units which are in the fast attack category anyway, there's another one I'd like to add, and that's Havocs to this as well. Because the thing you have to remember about Havocs is that they can move and shoot their heavy weapons with absolutely no modifiers to them whatsoever. And this is really important to remember, because unlike a lot of other armies where their special weapons and their heavy weapons are on units that, even if they can move and shoot, are quite a bit slower, Havocs don't have that disadvantage, and Havocs are still toughness 5. So that does give them a bit more resilience, even to some of the heavier guns in the game. But let's get back to those first ones. Obviously things such as Bikes have 2 wounds and toughness 5, which makes them nice and resilient. Possessed having 2 wounds as well and movement of 7 also makes them very good and very resilient. Warp Talons have a couple of really interesting things as well. First of all, they have a 5-up invulnerable save, and they have lightning claws. So in some respects, a small unit of Warp Talons can be a very good distraction. I will admit they are quite pricey at 23 points a model with only 1 wound, but the things to remember about the Warp Talons is that they can also deep strike, as it were, or arrive from reserve, and then charge into assault, and your opponent cannot overwatch them. So if you do have an opponent who's got a large number of automatically hitting weapons, such as flamers or burners or whatever, and you don't want them to be too effective, then Warp Talons might be good for that. And the reason I talk about these units specifically is because the 2 legions that will fit best for these are the ones that will give you the best chance for a first turn assault. And that is Dark Raiders, obviously, because you can advance and then charge straight away, but also Creations of Bile and Emperor's Children. Now, Emperor's Children is an obvious one. You always strike first in combat, unless your opponent has lots of abilities, but that's so specific that it's not really worth mentioning. And Creations of Bile, having your strength and your move boosted, is a very useful thing. And this allows you to maybe even skimp a little bit on taking high-powered power weapons, such as Power Fists in some places, and replacing them with higher AP weapons, because you will get more attacks in. You're not as reliant on the strength of your weapons to be carrying the weight of your army. But the other thing to remember here is that because all 3 of them have ways of making you faster, thankfully, they have a lot of stratagems that also boost you in combat. Things such as Combat Elixir can be very useful from the Emperor's Children side of things. Sinews from the Creations of Bile can make you even faster, making sure that you're guaranteed to get those in. And then you have to remember that Sorcerers can boost the slightly slower units with things such as Warp Time, and even Death Hex can be useful if you want to remove things such as invulnerable saves from certain units to make them a little bit more softer and a little bit easier to get through as well. And the reason I bring the Sorcerers up here is because you're going to need every advantage that you can in that first turn of combat. And if there's one piece of advice that I found quite frequently helps a lot when it comes to thinking about 40k and how to use your stratagems, is that the only time you want to be burning through your command points quickly is if and only if you're in your opponent's deployment zone in turn 1. Otherwise, you don't want to be burning them through because you're going to need them later in the game. And that's a really important thing to bear in mind. Stratagems in turn 1 should be minimised, and this is definitely a place where you can do that as long as you've got the right psychic powers and the right buffs. And the other thing you have to remember about this and the previous one and the next one is that core of Cultists and Dark Apostles obviously do still benefit somewhat from all of this, because if you do need them to follow along behind and just sit on objectives or just draw aggro, they can still do that. They can still be a distraction for your opponent between having to gun down all the big things or focus on the smaller things. But that's something just to bear in mind. The other thing to bear in mind with this Hounds and Hunters approach is that it allows you to take very much specific target assassination routes if you need to. So when we talk about characters for this one, as I mentioned before, the Lord Discordant is a fantastic choice for this one again because he's very fast. If we're feeling particularly risky, even a Demon Prince. Now, Demon Prince is something that I'm a bit on the fence about overall, just because they don't have as many wounds and they aren't quite as resilient as things like the Lord Discordant, and they can't hide as effectively as other characters. But what they do have, which is quite useful, is quite a high damage output. So if you can get them across the board quickly, this is a place where they will work out quite well for you. So just to quickly sum up the Hounds and Hunters way of playing, is lots of fast units, further boosted by the Legion traits that you can give to them. The special characters such as Fabius Bile for the creations of Bile obviously help here a little bit as well, and being able to maximise your ability to get across the board quickly and into combat, and whatever heavy weapons you do have, you can use them to stay mobile as well, so that if they need to reposition, they can. If you need to get them closer because they're shorter range, such as the chain cannons, they also can. So overall, it's fair to say that with this particular way of playing, if you want an army that's all about speed and power and getting across the board as quickly as possible, and then leaving that core, or that meat shield, to be the thing that sits on the objectives while the rest of your army is engaged in destroying your opponent, this is the way to do it. And this brings me on to my third and final way of playing, and that's Legion Synergy. Legion Synergy is a very, very, very vague term, I know, but it's the best way I can describe it, and it relies on a sleight of hand when it comes to playing the Chaos Marine Codex, and remembering a few certain ways that we limit ourselves when we play as Chaos Marines, rather than the rules limiting us to playing them. The first thing to remember about this is that Plague Marines, Noise Marines, and Rubric Marines are not limited by Legion. I'd say Khorne Berserkers as well, but I've already told you to forget about them, so forget about them. But those three aren't limited by Legion, and all three of them are very versatile, very useful, and very dangerous units. Granted, they all still only have one wound, whilst the Plague Marines and Rubric Marines in their respective codexes elsewhere have two. These guys still have the older rules. They still have things like Shock Assault and Death of the False Emperor, so they can boost their attacks in combat. But the other thing that these units can do is they can also take advantage of Death of the False Emperor, like I said, and they also benefit from some of the slightly older rules as well. So the Plague Marines in the Chaos Space Marine Codex still benefit from the old Disgusting Resilience, which is the 5-up Shrug, which is massively useful in this context, as it will still give you that vital edge in that first turn. If it doesn't go your way in the roll-off, they can soak up some firepower before you start to advance. And obviously the other thing which is quite handy about having an army for Alpha Legion, which is leaning more heavily into the Cultist Marines, is that for a certain level of psychology here, most of your opponents won't expect it. They won't be expecting to see Noise Marines or Plague Marines, which are Alpha Legion. So that is in and of itself is an advantage, simply because no one's going to know what's going to happen when you put those models on the board. Like I've said in previous videos, we have certain fixed ways of looking at certain armies, and this is a way to defy those expectations and play in a manner which will leave your opponents guessing, whilst you're able to explore a new way to play. But last of all, let's talk about the Night Lords quickly and how they benefit from all this. Now, obviously, the Plague Marine Sigil does a quite nice job of reducing your opponent's leadership by a further 1, so even if you're only in range of 1 Night Lords unit, suddenly they're -2, and even for Space Marines with And They Shall Know No Fear, that increases their chances quite drastically of them failing morale tests if you start targeting them. And obviously the other thing to remember about Night Lords is a lot of their stratagems are reliant upon things such as ambush and guerrilla tactics, but because you can still use these particular abilities with Plague Marines, Rubric Marines, and Noise Marines, it means that at every range there are different ways to make it work quite nicely for you. I just like to cite the From the Night stratagem, which is adding 2 to your charge results, and when you're resolving an attack with a melee weapon, you add 1 to the hit roll if you're charging out of a terrain feature. It sets quite a lot when you're able to do that with something like Plague Marines or Noise Marines, who are already quite powerful. And bearing in mind that when you then think about things such as Hit and Run or Vox Scream, which are also very useful stratagems to make use of at various points, when you then synergize those with the fact that you have the Legion trait and units that hugely benefit from these in terms of having boosted toughness and unique weapons, it makes a massive difference. I'd also very quickly like to mention that having a Lord Discordant or a Demon Prince as your Warlord for Night Lords makes very good use of the Warlord traits, since most of them are about getting rerolls to get further or make you faster, and even reducing damage when it comes to some of the artifacts they have, making very powerful units even more resilient to most people's damage output. So, just to very quickly sum up what we've said for Legion Synergy, Alpha Legion and Night Lords are the units you want.
looking at Rubric Marines, Plague Marines, and Noise Marines in manners and in legions that you wouldn't normally think of them as, and it's important to remember that you can use them in this way. You can use them even in Word Bearers and Black Legion as well, who I haven't mentioned till now, but I'll tell you why that is in a second. And it's important to consider that because you can use these across all the legions, there are a lot of ways to use them in ways that your opponents wouldn't expect. They see Plague Marines, they think Death Guard. They see Rubric Marines, they think Thousand Suns. But there are ways to defy that, and as such defies the expectations and therefore some of the abilities to counter them that you always can. The reason I haven't mentioned Black Legion is because Black Legion falls quite comfortably into all three of these categories. You can use Noise Marines, Rubric Marines, and Plague Marines in Black Legion, and many people do. Demonkin fit quite comfortably into that as well, as do the Hounds and the Hunted method of playing, where everything's a bit faster, and it being quite cohesive and quite concise, which is why I didn't specifically pigeonhole them to anyone. They're not like the Ultramarines, who definitely have some strengths, even if they are hidden away and somewhat unintentional from the design point of view. Black Legion have a very holistic approach to playing that can fit anything you want to do. So, just to quickly sum up what we've discussed here today, the three ways of playing, which really come down to speed, resilience, and in some case a little bit of a battle of wits, and getting creative with the assets you have, show that there are ways to play Chaos Space Marines that have become very different to how we're used to seeing them. And I think the important thing to remember is that our traditional view of the Chaos Space Marines in a lot of ways simply will not be what it has been in the past, considering where 40k is now at time of recording. And that is, Chaos Space Marines won't play like Space Marines for a while. We have to play smarter, and we have to play with a far better understanding of the resources we have to our disposal, and to make use of all of those resources as well. There are ways to specialise, as I have said, but I think the important thing is to remember is that you do have more options than you might think you do, and Chaos Marines aren't actually as much of a write-off as some would lead you to believe. But in any case, and as always, I want to hear your thoughts on this. What do you think of the state of Chaos Space Marines, and do you think my three options are of any help to you? Do you think there are other ways of playing that could also help Chaos Space Marines, and are there any other combinations or synergizing techniques that you can think of that could boost them? Let me know your thoughts. I look forward to hearing from you.
So those are my thoughts and ways to play Chaos Marines whilst making the most of the strength now that they have. So you don't have to wait for another codex to hope to see what changes, you can just play with them as is. And I hope you found it useful and helpful, and whilst you're here, like, subscribe, comment below anything that you've got to say about it, all that good YouTube shilly stuff. I'm saying now that I'm also going down to one video a week. Things have started to pick up again elsewhere, so I can only really commit enough time to make one video a week, but I hope to see you all next time anyway. Thanks for watching, goodbye, and have a lovely day.